Supreme Archon Velthara floated in his crystal chamber, his body made of pure light and energy shimmering like a rainbow. For 3,000 years, he had ruled the Velnathi people with wisdom and pride. His species had evolved beyond the need for crude flesh and bone. They existed as beings of pure consciousness, able to think across multiple dimensions at once. To them, physical bodies were primitive relics of a barbaric past. The emergency alert made his crystalline form pulse with worry. The Void Plague had already consumed 12 star systems in their territory. Entire planets simply vanished into nothingness, as if they had never existed. His greatest scientists worked day and night, but the plague spread faster than they could understand. With heavy reluctance, Velthara had sent a distress call to the Galactic Council, hoping they would send the Zephyrians with their advanced quantum technology, or perhaps the wise luminari who could manipulate time itself. When the response arrived, Velthara's form flickered from blue to angry red. The message was short and direct. Human Rapid Response Fleet dispatched. Estimated arrival in 6 standard cycles. Prepare for immediate cooperation. Humans. Those hairy, meat-eating creatures from the Outer Rim? Velthara's consciousness recoiled, in disgust. He immediately accessed the galactic database to review their species file, hoping there had been some terrible mistake. The information made him even more horrified. Humans were bipedal mammals who had only achieved spaceflight a few hundred years ago. They still lived in physical bodies made of flesh, blood, and bone. They ate dead plants and animals to survive, stuffing organic matter into holes in their faces. They grew hair all over their bodies like wild beasts. Most shocking of all, they were completely locked into 3-dimensional thinking. They couldn't even perceive the higher planes of existence that the Velnathi considered basic reality. "This is outrageous," Velthara declared to his council, his voice echoing through dimensions. "These primitive apes still live in caves compared to our crystal cities. They fight with metal weapons while we command the very fabric of space and time. How dare the council send such inferior beings to rescue us?" His chief advisor, a being of swirling silver light named Zarketh, tried to calm him. "Perhaps they have some hidden abilities we don't know about, Supreme Archon." "Hidden abilities?" Velthara's laughter sounded like breaking glass. "They can't even exist without constantly inhaling gas from their atmosphere. They leak salt water from their visual organs when they experience emotional distress. They are so primitive that they still reproduce by physically combining genetic material like bacteria. What could such creatures possibly do that we cannot?" But even as anger consumed him, Velthara felt time slipping away. Long-range sensors showed the Void Plague advancing toward their core worlds. The beautiful crystal cities of New Velnath would be consumed within days. Their capital world, home to 50 billion conscious beings, faced complete annihilation. His people's screams echoed across dimensional barriers as the plague touched their settlements, erasing them from existence. As if they had never been born. Velthara tried one more desperate communication to the Galactic Council. "Surely you can send someone more appropriate," he pleaded. "The ethereal lords, perhaps, or the cosmic shepherds. Anyone but these barbaric mammals." The Council's response was cold and final. "Human forces are our fastest responders to existential threats. You will cooperate fully or face the consequences alone." As reports came in of 3 more systems falling to the plague, Velthara realized he had no choice. These disgusting creatures were his only hope, no matter how much the thought sickened him. Soon, primitive humans would walk among his perfect crystal halls, bringing their crude flesh and savage minds into his refined civilization. The very idea made his energy form shudder with revulsion. The space around New Velnath suddenly rippled as 12 human ships dropped out of hyperspace. Admiral Lee Minho stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the beautiful crystal cities floating in space ahead of them. The Velnathi structures looked like massive diamonds catching starlight, each one perfectly smooth and glowing with inner light. They were undeniably beautiful, but Minho had seen beauty before. Right now he was more interested in saving lives. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the Velnathi leadership," reported his communications officer, Lieutenant Park Jisu. "They want to establish contact immediately." "Put them through," Minho replied, straightening his uniform. He had read the briefing files about the Velnathi during the journey. Energy beings, highly advanced, considered themselves superior to most species. He expected some attitude, but he was here to do a job. When the hologram activated, Minho found himself face-to-face with Supreme Archon Velthara. The alien was tall and elegant, made of shifting crystalline light that moved like liquid mercury. Beautiful, certainly, but the expression on that translucent face was one of pure disgust. Velthara's gaze swept over the human admiral, taking in every detail with obvious revulsion. These creatures were even more primitive than their files suggested. The one called Minho stood there in his crude fabric covering, his skin a disturbing shade of brown-pink that seemed to change color as blood moved beneath it. Coarse black hair grew from his scalp in an uncontrolled mess. Most disturbing were his eyes, small wet orbs that moved independently in their sockets, constantly leaking moisture. "So," Velthara began, his voice dripping with disdain, "these are the rescuers the Council has sent us. Mammals." Minho remained calm, used to dealing with hostile first contacts. "Supreme Archon, I'm Admiral Lee Minho of the Human Defense Fleet. We're here to help with your Void Plague situation. My science teams are ready to begin analysis immediately." Velthara's form flickered with amusement. "Your science teams?" The words came out like an insult. "Admiral, do you understand what you're dealing with? This plague operates on quantum levels your species cannot even perceive. It exists in 11 dimensions simultaneously. Your primitive minds are locked into 3-dimensional thinking. You cannot comprehend the complexity involved." Behind Minho, his crew exchanged glances. They had encountered arrogant aliens before, but this one was particularly condescending. Chief Science Officer Dr. Kim Hye-jin stepped forward. She was a small woman with intelligent eyes and graying hair, someone who had spent 30 years studying xenobiology. "With respect, Supreme Archon," Dr. Kim said politely, "we've dealt with dimensional anomalies before. Our instruments may look simple to you, but they're quite effective at measuring quantum fluctuations." Velthara actually laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Your instruments? Those crude metal boxes that require constant calibration. We have sensors that exist in pure thought, devices that can analyze reality itself. Yet our most advanced technology cannot stop this. Plague, and you think your primitive tools will succeed." The Archon moved closer to the hologram, studying the humans like specimens in a laboratory. "Look at yourselves. You require constant intake of atmospheric gases to survive. You consume dead organic matter for energy. Your bodies leak fluids from multiple orifices. You experience emotional distress that manifests as salt water escaping your visual organs. You are biological accidents, barely evolved beyond your tree-dwelling ancestors." Minho's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Supreme Archon, we didn't come here to debate evolution. We came to help. Every minute we waste talking is another minute the plague spreads. My teams need access to the affected areas and your research data." "Access?" Velthara's form pulsed with indignation. "You want to enter our sacred spaces with your crude flesh and contaminating breath. You want to handle our research with those clumsy appendages that can barely manipulate matter." Dr. Kim spoke up again, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Those clumsy appendages have performed surgery on quantum computers and built faster-than-light engines. We may not be as elegant as your people, but we get results." Velthara's expression grew even more contemptuous. "Results? What results could primitives achieve that we cannot? You exist in a single dimension while we transcend space and time itself. You think in linear patterns while we perceive infinite possibilities. You are organic accidents, and we are the next step in evolution." The hologram chamber fell silent except for the quiet hum of machinery. Minho looked at the arrogant alien leader and made a decision that would define everything that followed. "Supreme Archon," he said quietly, "your people are dying. Our people volunteered to help. If you want to keep insulting us instead of working together, that's your choice. But every second you waste on your superiority complex is another second. The plague gets stronger." Dr. Park Jiwoo stepped into the Velnathi research facility, carrying a battered metal case that looked like it had survived a dozen wars. The crystalline walls around him pulsed with ethereal light, and floating data screens showed complex equations that seemed to shift and dance in the air. Everything was beautiful, elegant, and completely alien. But Jiwoo had work to do. He set his case down on what appeared to be a work surface and opened it, revealing instruments that looked crude compared to the Velnathi technology surrounding him. A basic microscope, some chemical analyzers, and a tablet computer that was already 5 years old. The Velnathi researchers floating nearby watched with barely concealed amusement as this primitive creature began unpacking his ancient tools. "Fascinating," whispered one of the Velnathi scientists, a being of swirling purple energy named Kethmoran. "Look how it requires physical contact with its instruments. So inefficient." Jiwoo ignored the comments and carefully extracted a sample of plague-infected material from a containment unit. Under the microscope, it looked like ordinary space dust, but he knew appearances could be deceiving. He began taking measurements, writing notes on his tablet with a stylus, completely focused on his work. What happened next made Supreme Archon Velthara's crystalline form flicker with irritation. The human reached into his pack and pulled out what looked like a wrapped food item. Without any shame or awareness of how disgusting his actions were, Jiwoo unwrapped it and took a bite. He was eating solid matter, right there in the sterile research facility. "Unbelievable," Velthara muttered to his advisor. "The creature is consuming dead organic material while conducting scientific research. How can it maintain any level of precision while engaging in such barbaric behavior?" But as the hours passed, something strange began to happen. While the Velnathi researchers floated in meditative states, trying to perceive the plague through 11 dimensions simultaneously, the human scientist worked methodically through his simple 3-dimensional approach. He took measurements, recorded data, and slowly built a picture of what they were dealing with. Chief Engineer Kim Nari arrived to help set up additional monitoring equipment. She was a compact woman with calloused hands and oil stains on her uniform. The Velnathi watched in fascination and horror as she manually adjusted sensitive instruments, her fingers moving with surprising delicacy despite their crude appearance. "How does it achieve such precision?" wondered Kethmoran. "Those appendages have no quantum sensitivity, no dimensional awareness, they're just flesh and bone." Kim worked for 6 straight hours, fine-tuning sensors and calibrating detection arrays. She had to stop occasionally to drink water and stretch her back, physical limitations that the energy-based Velnathi found primitive. But her equipment was soon providing readings that the Velnathi's advanced sensors had missed. "This is impossible," declared Zarketh, Velthara's chief advisor. "Our quantum consciousness allows us to perceive reality across multiple dimensions. These creatures are trapped in 3-dimensional thinking. How are they detecting patterns we cannot see?" The answer came when Dr. Park Jiwoo made his first breakthrough. While eating what appeared to be a sandwich, he suddenly stopped chewing and stared at his tablet screen. His eyes widened as he saw something the Velnathi had completely missed. "The plague has anchor points," he announced, his voice cutting through the ethereal humming of the Velnathi researchers. "Look at these readings. It's not just spreading randomly through 11 dimensions. It's tethered to specific 3-dimensional coordinates." The Velnathi researchers immediately focused their consciousness on the areas Jiwoo had identified. To their amazement, he was right. The plague was anchored to ordinary 3-dimensional space, but because they had been looking across multiple dimensions simultaneously, they had missed the simple pattern right in front of them. "But how did you see this when we could not?" asked Kethmoran, his energy form flickering with confusion. Jiwoo looked up from his ancient tablet, a piece of food still stuck between his teeth. "Sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. You were looking at everything at once across all dimensions. I just looked at what was right here in normal space." Kim Nari nodded, not looking up from her equipment calibrations. "It's like trying to thread a needle while looking through a kaleidoscope. Sometimes simpler is better." Velthara felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. These primitive creatures, with their crude tools and barbaric habits, had discovered something in hours that his most advanced researchers had missed for weeks. Their limitation to 3-dimensional thinking, which should have been a handicap, had somehow become an advantage. As he watched the human scientist take another bite of his food, While revolutionizing their understanding of the plague, Velthara began to wonder if perhaps there was more to these creatures than he had assumed. Sergeant. Choi Dong-ho stood at the edge of the contaminated zone, studying the swirling darkness that had once been a beautiful crystal garden. The void plague twisted and writhed like black smoke, consuming everything it touched and leaving absolutely nothing behind. Not even empty space remained, just a horrible absence that hurt to look at directly. "All right, people, listen up," Dong-ho called to his squad of 20 human soldiers. "We need a perimeter around this thing. Standard containment formation, but keep your distance. We don't know how fast this stuff spreads." The Velnathi military observers floated nearby, their crystalline forms shimmering with skeptical energy. General Morthek, a being of pure silver light, had been watching these primitive soldiers for the past hour with growing bewilderment. These creatures moved with their crude flesh and bone bodies, carrying simple metal weapons that fired small projectiles. How could such basic technology be effective against a force that consumed reality itself? Dong-ho positioned his troops in a perfect defensive circle, each soldier exactly where they needed to be to provide overlapping fields of fire. His movements were efficient and confident, the result of 20 years in the military. He had fought pirates in the asteroid belts, defended colonies from alien raiders, and survived 3 different first contact scenarios. This was just another day at the office. "Sir, should we set up the plasma barriers?" asked Private Lee Minjae, a young soldier who still looked nervous around the floating aliens. "Negative," Dong-ho replied, checking his rifle. "These things work better." He held up his weapon, a simple kinetic rifle that fired metal slugs at high velocity. Dr. Park's tests showed that solid projectiles disrupt the plague's structure better than energy weapons. General Morthek's form flickered with disbelief. "Impossible. Those primitive projectiles cannot affect something that exists across 11 dimensions." But as they watched, a tendril of plague matter began extending toward the human perimeter. Dong-ho raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots. The metal bullets struck the dark tendril, and to everyone's amazement, it recoiled and dissolved. The simple kinetic impact had somehow disrupted the plague's quantum structure. "How?" whispered Morthek. "Our most advanced energy weapons barely." "Slow it down," Dong-ho shrugged. "Sometimes the old ways work best. My grandfather used to say that if you hit something hard enough, it'll break, no matter what it's made of." Meanwhile, at Research Station Zeta 7, alarms began blaring. The plague had somehow breached their containment and was slowly eating through. The station's outer hull. Chief Engineer Kim Nari was in the power control room when the first alerts came through, and she immediately knew they were in serious trouble. "All personnel, this is Engineer Kim," she announced over the comm system. "We have a hull breach in sections 12 through 15. The plague is spreading toward the main reactor. I need everyone to evacuate to the emergency shuttles immediately." Velthara, monitoring the situation from his command ship, expected the humans to follow their own evacuation order. Surely these primitive creatures would flee when faced with certain death. But as he watched through the security cameras, Kim Nari did something that defied all logic. She stayed behind. For the next 18 hours, Kim worked alone in the failing station while the plague consumed it around her. She crawled through maintenance tunnels, rewired power systems by hand, and manually rerouted the station's energy flow to keep the containment fields active. Her only sustenance was a bitter black liquid she called coffee, which she drank from a metal container while sparks flew around her head. "Why doesn't she leave?" Velthara asked his advisors. "The station is doomed. She will die if she remains. Perhaps she has entered a meditative trance," suggested Zarketh. "Some species achieve transcendent states during extreme stress." But Kim wasn't meditating. She was cursing creatively in 3 different languages as she wrestled with a damaged power coupling. Her hands were burned from electrical feedback, her uniform was torn and stained, and she hadn't slept in almost a day. She looked nothing like a transcendent being. She looked like someone too stubborn to give up. "Come on, you piece of junk," she muttered, forcing 2 power cables together with her bare hands. The connection sparked and held, restoring power to the containment grid just as the plague reached the reactor core. The containment field flared to life, stopping the plague inches from the station's heart. Kim had saved not just the research data, but also prevented a reactor explosion that would have destroyed 3 nearby worlds. When rescue ships finally reached her, Kim was unconscious at her workstation, her tools still clutched in her hands. She had worked until her body simply shut down from exhaustion. Velthara stared at the security footage in complete confusion. This primitive creature had risked everything, suffered terribly, and accomplished the impossible without any dimensional powers or quantum consciousness. She had succeeded through nothing but determination, skill, and an apparently limitless supply of that bitter liquid stimulant. For the first time in his long life, the Supreme Archon began to wonder if perhaps there were different kinds of strength in the universe. Dr. Park Jiwoo had been awake for 36 hours straight, surviving on nothing but coffee and determination. His eyes burned from staring at data screens, and his back ached from hunching over his instruments, but he couldn't stop now. He was so close to understanding something important about the Void Plague that he could almost taste it. The breakthrough came at 3:47 a.m. ship time. Jiwoo was comparing plague behavior patterns when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. He sat up straight, nearly spilling his coffee, and ran the calculations again, then again. Each time, the results were the same. "This can't be right," he whispered to himself, but the data didn't lie. He immediately called Admiral Lee Minho and Supreme Archon Velthara for an emergency meeting. Within minutes, the holographic conference room was filled with human officers and floating Velnathi officials, all waiting to hear what the exhausted scientist had discovered. "I've figured out how the plague works," Jiwoo began, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "And the news isn't good for anyone who can think in multiple dimensions." Velthara's crystalline form pulsed with impatience. "Explain yourself, Primitive. What have you discovered that our quantum consciousness could not perceive?" Jiwoo pulled up his data on the main screen, showing wave patterns and energy readings that looked like chaotic squiggles to most people, but he had learned to read them, like a book. "The Void Plague doesn't just consume matter and energy," he said slowly. "It feeds on consciousness itself. And specifically, it feeds on quantum consciousness, the ability to exist and think across multiple dimensions simultaneously." The room fell silent. Velthara's form flickered as he processed this information. "That's impossible," declared Kethamoran, one of the Velnathi researchers. "Consciousness cannot be consumed like physical matter." "That's where you're wrong," Jiwoo replied, bringing up more data. "Look at these readings from the plague zones. Every time it encounters a being with dimensional awareness, it doesn't just destroy their body. It drains their consciousness across all dimensional planes. The more advanced the consciousness, the more it has to feed on." Admiral Minho leaned forward. "What does this mean for the Velnathi?" Jiwoo's expression was grim. "It means they're the perfect food source. Their entire evolution toward quantum consciousness has made them incredibly vulnerable. The plague seeks them out because they provide more nourishment than any other species." Velthara's form began to darken as the implications hit him. "You're saying our transcendence, our evolution beyond crude physical existence, has made you sitting ducks," Jiwoo finished bluntly. "I'm sorry, but it's true. The more dimensionally aware you are, the more the plague wants to consume you. That's why it's spreading so fast through Velnathi space. You're not just victims, you're attracting it." The silence that followed was deafening. For 3,000 years, the Velnathi had prided themselves on being the most evolved species in the galaxy. Their ability to exist across multiple dimensions was their greatest achievement, the thing that made them superior to all other life forms. Now they were being told it was a death sentence. "But wait," said Dr. Kim Heejin, the human xenobiologist. "If the plague feeds on quantum consciousness, what about species that don't have it?" Jiwoo nodded, knowing where she was going with this. "That's the other part of my discovery. Humans and other species locked into three-dimensional thinking are naturally resistant. We don't have quantum consciousness for the plague to feed on. In fact, our simple, crude way of thinking actually repels it." "Repels it?" Velthara's voice was barely a whisper. "The plague can't get a grip on our consciousness because it's too basic, too primitive. We think in straight lines, in simple, cause and effect. There's nothing for it to latch onto." Jiwoo paused, realizing how this would sound to the proud Velnathi. "Your superiority has become your weakness. Our primitiveness is our strength. General Morthek's silver form pulsed, with desperate hope. Then you can fight it? You can stop it? We can, Admiral Minho confirmed. Our ships can get close to the plague without being consumed. Our soldiers can fight it with simple weapons. Our scientists can study it without their minds being drained. Velthara felt his worldview crumbling around him. Everything he had believed about evolution and progress was wrong. The Velnathi had spent millennia evolving beyond their physical forms, becoming beings of pure thought and energy. They had looked down on species like humans as evolutionary dead ends, crude creatures trapped in flesh and limited thinking. But now those same limitations were saving humanity, while his people's greatest achievements were killing them. The primitive apes, he said quietly, are immune to the plague that destroys gods. Jiwu set down his coffee cup and looked directly at the Supreme Archon. Sometimes being simple is better than being sophisticated. Sometimes staying grounded keeps you alive. When flying too high gets you killed. For the first time in his long existence, Velthara understood that evolution wasn't always about becoming more complex. Sometimes survival meant staying exactly as you were. The warning came at dawn. Long-range sensors detected a massive surge of void plague racing toward New Velnath, the crystal capital that housed 50 billion Velnathi souls. The dark wave moved like a tsunami of nothingness, consuming 3 outer settlements in minutes and growing stronger with each consciousness. It devoured. Admiral Lee Minho stood on his bridge, watching the horrifying display on the main screen. The plague had formed into something that looked like a giant black storm, crackling with stolen energy from the mines it had consumed. It would reach the capital in less than 6 hours. Sir, the Velnathi evacuation fleet is moving toward the capital, reported Lieutenant Park Jisoo from the communications station. But they're having problems. Minho could see why. The beautiful crystalline ships that had looked so elegant before were now flickering in and out of existence as they approached the plague zone. Their pilots, with their quantum consciousness, were being affected even at this distance. Ships would phase into higher dimensions to avoid the plague's influence, only to find they couldn't phase back down to normal space to pick up refugees. Their ships keep disappearing, observed Commander Yoon Hajin, Minho's second-in-command. They can't maintain stability in 3-dimensional space anymore. On the Velnathi command ship, Supreme Archon Velthara watched in growing horror as his most advanced vessels became useless. Captain Velmoth, one of his finest pilots, was struggling to keep her ship solid long enough to land at an evacuation site. I cannot maintain dimensional cohesion, she reported, her voice strained. My consciousness keeps slipping into quantum flux. The plague's influence extends much farther than we calculated. Velthara realized with dawning terror that his people's greatest strength had become their fatal weakness. Their ability to transcend dimensions meant they couldn't stay grounded in normal space when the plague was near. They were like birds who had forgotten how to land. That's when Admiral Minho made a decision that would be remembered for centuries. All ships. This is Admiral Minho, he announced on the fleet-wide channel. We're going in. Full speed toward the capital. Begin evacuation procedures immediately. Sir, said Lieutenant Han Soo-young from the pilot station, we'll be flying directly into the contamination zone. The plague will be all around us. Minho nodded grimly. That's exactly why we're the only ones who can do this. Plot a course. For the capital's main platform. We're going to get those people out. The human fleet dove toward New Velnath like hawks hunting prey. Their ships, crude and angular compared to Velnathi vessels, stayed rock-solid in 3-dimensional space. The plague swirled around them like black fog, but it couldn't get a grip on their simple non-quantum systems. Lieutenant Han Soo-young piloted her transport ship with steady hands, weaving between floating crystal towers while the void plague raged around them. Her ship shook from spatial distortions, but she kept it level and true. Behind her, the cargo bay was being prepared to receive refugees. This is insane, she muttered to herself as tentacles of dark energy whipped past her cockpit window. But if it's insane and it works, it's not insane. On the capital platform, millions of Velnathi civilians huddled in terror as the plague surrounded their city. These beings of pure energy and light flickered weakly, their consciousness fragmented by fear. When the first human transport ship touched down, many of them couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Impossible," whispered a civilian named Lethara, as she watched crude-looking humans in environment suits running toward them. "How are they maintaining cohesion in this chaos?" The answer was simple. The humans couldn't lose dimensional cohesion because they had never had it in the first place. Corporal Kim Tae-hyung was first off his transport, carrying medical supplies and emergency equipment. He had volunteered for this mission knowing he might not come back. The Velnathi civilians recoiled from his approach. His solid flesh and blood form seemed almost grotesque to beings of pure energy. "It's okay," he said gently, his voice coming through his suit's speakers. "We're here to help. Please come with us to the ships." What happened next broke something inside Velthara's crystalline heart. The human soldiers, these primitive apes, he had dismissed with such contempt, began carefully guiding Velnathi civilians to safety. They were patient with the elderly, gentle with the frightened children, and respectful to everyone despite having been treated like inferior beings. Medic Jung Hyunwoo knelt beside an injured Velnathi child, whose energy form was flickering dangerously. The child's parents had been consumed by the plague, leaving her alone and terrified. Hyunwoo couldn't touch her directly, their biologies were too different, but he positioned his medical scanner carefully and began treating her quantum injuries, with equipment designed for energy-based life forms. "There you go, little one," he said softly, even though she couldn't understand his words. "You're going to be okay. We'll get you somewhere safe." For 12 hours, human ships flew continuous missions into the plague zone, while Velnathi vessels remained helplessly outside the contamination area. The humans worked without rest, loading transport after transport with refugees. They flew through spatial storms that would have driven quantum-conscious beings insane, navigating by simple instruments and human intuition. Velthara watched from his command ship as these beings he had called barbaric saved his people with methodical efficiency. Every transport that lifted off carried thousands of Velnathi to safety, piloted by humans who risked their lives for people who had shown them nothing but scorn. By the time the last refugee ship cleared the capital, 47 million Velnathi had been evacuated. The humans had lost 3 ships and dozens of crew members, but they had saved an entire civilization. As New Velnath disappeared into the void plague, consumed like everything else the darkness touched, Velthara realized that everything he thought he knew about strength, evolution, and worth had been completely wrong. Dr. Park Ji-woo stood in the research lab, staring at the device that could save the galaxy or kill him trying. The dimensional anchor looked surprisingly simple. A metal cylinder about the size of a coffee can, covered in blinking lights and humming with contained energy. After 72 hours of non-stop work, fueled by nothing but determination and caffeine, he had finally cracked the puzzle. "It works by forcing the plague to collapse back into normal 3-dimensional space," he explained to the gathered officers and Velnathi leaders. His voice was hoarse, his eyes bloodshot, but his hands were steady as he held the device. "Once it's locked into our dimension, conventional weapons can destroy it. The problem is deployment." Admiral Lee Minho studied the technical readouts on his tablet. "What kind of deployment are we talking about?" Ji-woo's expression grew grim. "Manual. Someone has to carry this thing directly into the plague's core and activate it by hand. The quantum interference is too strong for remote detonation or automated systems." The room fell silent as everyone understood what he was saying. "Commander." Yoon Hajin was the first to speak. "How close is directly into the core?" "0 distance," Ji-woo replied quietly. "The person deploying it would have to be inside the plague's epicenter when it activates. They'd be vaporized instantly when the plague collapses back into normal space." Supreme Archon Velthara's crystalline form flickered with desperate hope and terrible understanding. "But surely one of my people could—" "No," Dr. Kim Hyejin interrupted gently. "The quantum consciousness that makes your people so vulnerable to the plague also makes this mission impossible for them. Any Velnathi who gets that close would be consumed before they could activate the device." "What about using an automated probe?" suggested General Morthek. Chief Engineer Kim Nari shook her head. The plague disrupts all electronic systems within 1,000 kilometers of its center. This has to be done the old-fashioned way, by someone who can think and react in real time. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. Only humans could get close enough to deploy the anchor, and whoever did it would die in the process. Admiral Minho stood up slowly, his decision already made. "I'll do it." "Sir, no." Commander Yoon Hajin protested immediately. "The fleet needs you. I should be the one to go." "With respect, Commander, I outrank you. This is my call to make." Dr. Park Ji-woo cleared his throat. "Actually, I think I should be the one. I designed the device. I know exactly how to activate it under pressure." "Absolutely not," Minho replied firmly. "You're too valuable. The galaxy might need that brain of yours again someday." What followed was something Velthara had never seen before. An argument over who got to die. Each human officer insisted they should be the one to make the ultimate sacrifice. They weren't fighting to avoid death. They were fighting for the honor of dying for others. "This is madness," Velthara whispered to his advisor. "Why are they volunteering for certain death?" Zarketh's energy form pulsed with confusion. "I do not understand their logic. Surely the most rational choice would be to send whoever is least important. But Admiral Minho had made his decision. "I'm going, and that's final. Commander Yoon, you'll come with me to pilot the ship. Dr. Park, I need you there to make sure the device works properly." "Sir, you don't need to take anyone else," Yoon protested. "I can handle this alone." "No one goes alone," Minho said firmly. "We started this mission together, and we'll finish it together." Velthara's form flared with sudden panic. For the first time in his existence, he was watching beings he had dismissed as primitive demonstrate a kind of nobility he had never seen among his own people. "Wait," he called out desperately. "There must be another way. You cannot throw your lives away like this." Admiral Minho turned to face the Supreme Archon, and Velthara was shocked to see peace in the human's eyes, not fear. "We're not throwing our lives away," Minho said quietly. "We're using them for something that matters. Your people are dying. Our people will be next if this plague isn't stopped. This is what we signed up for when we put on these uniforms." "But you could live," Velthara pleaded, his voice breaking with an emotion he had never felt before. "You could retreat, find another solution, preserve yourselves." Commander Yoon smiled sadly. "Supreme Archon, with respect, that's not who we are. We came here to save lives, not to play it safe." Dr. Park Ji-woo was already packing the dimensional anchor into a protective case. "Besides, someone has to do it. Might as well be us." Velthara realized he was witnessing something his transcendent people had lost in their evolution, beyond physical form, the courage that comes from accepting mortality, the strength that grows from knowing life is finite and precious. These humans weren't brave despite being mortal. They were brave because they were mortal. "I don't understand," Velthara admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "How can you face death so calmly?" Admiral Minho checked his sidearm and sealed his helmet. "Because, Supreme Archon, some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth living for. The trick is knowing the difference." As the three humans headed for their final mission, Velthara felt something crack inside his crystalline heart. These beings he had called primitive possessed something infinitely precious that his advanced civilization had forgotten: the willingness to sacrifice everything for others, to even those who had shown them nothing but contempt. The small human ship looked impossibly fragile as it approached the heart of the void plague. Admiral Lee Minho sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls despite knowing he was flying toward certain death. Behind him, Commander Yoon Hajin monitored the ship's systems while Dr. Park Ji-woo made final adjustments to the dimensional anchor. "Hull temperature rising," Yoon reported calmly. "We're entering the outer edge of the plague zone." Through the cockpit window, they could see the plague's true horror up close. It wasn't just darkness, it was the complete absence of everything. Where it touched space, even the stars disappeared, leaving wounds in reality itself. The ship shuddered as dimensional forces tried to tear it apart. On his command vessel, Supreme Archon Velthara watched the human ship's progress with growing anguish. Every instinct told him to order them back, to find another way, but he knew there was no other choice. His most advanced warships couldn't even approach the plague's outer edge without their quantum-conscious crews being driven insane. Entering the middle zone, Minho announced over the comm. His voice was steady, professional, as if he were reporting routine flight data instead of flying into hell. Ships holding together so far, the plague began to affect their vessel more severely. Warning lights flashed across every console as the ship's hull started to buckle from dimensional stress. But unlike the Velnathi ships that would phase out of existence to protect themselves, the human vessel stayed locked in normal three-dimensional space, taking the punishment and continuing forward. Port engine failing, Yoon called out as sparks flew from his control panel. Compensating with starboard thrusters, Dr. Park Jiwoo clutched the dimensional anchor tightly, feeling the device grow warm in his hands as it responded to the plague's energy. The anchor is charging up, we're definitely close enough. Through the chaos, they could see the plague's epicenter, a swirling vortex of absolute nothingness that hurt to look at directly. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like staring into the eye of creation itself being undone. There, Minho said quietly, pointing toward the center. That's where we need to be. The ship lurched violently as they entered the inner zone. The hull began to glow red-hot from dimensional friction, and several systems failed simultaneously. But the three humans pressed on, their crude metal ship somehow holding together where advanced crystalline vessels would have been torn apart. Hull. Breach in sections 4 and 6, Yoon reported as alarms blared around them. Life support failing. We've got maybe 2 minutes of air left. That's all we need, Minho replied, pushing the engines to maximum power for one final thrust toward the epicenter. Velthara watched in horrified fascination as the human ship dove straight into the heart of destruction. His people's most sophisticated sensors couldn't even perceive what was happening in there. The dimensional chaos was too intense. But somehow, these primitive beings were navigating by instinct and determination alone. Now! Dr. Park Jiwoo shouted as they reached the center of the vortex. He activated the dimensional anchor just as the ship began to disintegrate around them. The device worked exactly as designed. The void plague, suddenly forced back into three-dimensional space, began to collapse in on itself, like a balloon. The process was violent and spectacular. Reality snapped back into place with a sound like thunder across dimensions. Admiral Minho's final transmission came through just as his ship was torn apart by the collapsing plague. His voice was calm, even grateful. "This is Admiral Lee Minho to all Velnathi vessels. The anchor is deployed. The plague is collapsing. It's been an honor to serve alongside your people. Tell them we were proud to help." The transmission cut to static as the ship was vaporized in the dimensional implosion, but it worked. The void plague, stripped of its multidimensional nature, became vulnerable to conventional forces. Velnathi energy weapons, useless before, now cut through the weakened plague like light through darkness. Within hours, the entire infestation was destroyed. Velthara floated in his command chamber, staring at the space where the plague had been. Stars were visible again, clean and bright against the black of space. His people were safe. Billions of lives had been saved, all because 3 humans had chosen to die for people who had called them primitive apes. "Supreme Archon," his advisor, Zarketh said softly. "The final casualty reports are in. We lost the human ship and all 3 crew members. No other casualties." Velthara's crystalline form dimmed with grief deeper than any he had ever known. "They saved us all," he whispered. "These beings we called barbaric and crude. They gave everything to save people who treated them with contempt. Sir, the human fleet is requesting permission to hold a memorial service for their fallen comrades." "Permission granted," Velthara replied immediately. "And Zarketh, I want every Velnathi vessel to participate. It's the least we can do." As he watched the stars shine in space that had been consumed by darkness just hours before, Velthara finally understood what true nobility looked like. It wasn't about transcending physical limitations or achieving quantum consciousness. It was about the willingness to sacrifice everything for others, even when those others didn't deserve it. The primitive humans had taught his advanced civilization the most important lesson in the universe, that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what you can become, but from what you're willing to give up for others. Supreme Archon Velthara stood before the memorial in perfect silence, his crystalline form reflecting the soft light of distant stars. The monument was simple by Velnati standards, just 3 pillars of polished metal reaching toward the sky, each one inscribed with a human name: Admiral Lee Minho, Commander Yoon Hajin, and Dr. Park Ji-woo. No flowing crystal architecture, no dimensional sculptures that existed in 11 planes at once. Just solid, 3-dimensional metal that would stand here for 1,000 years. The simplicity was deliberate. It was what the humans would have wanted. Velthara activated his personal recorder, preparing to make his final log entry about the Void Plague crisis. But as he began to speak, he found himself struggling to find the right words. How do you explain that everything you believed about superiority and evolution was wrong? Personal log, Supreme Archon Velthara, final entry regarding the Void Plague incident, he began, his voice echoing strangely in the still air. I have spent the last 7 days reviewing our encounter with the human species, and I find myself questioning fundamental assumptions that have guided our civilization for millennia. He paused, looking at the names carved into the metal. Minho, Hajin, Ji-woo, simple names belonging to beings who had accomplished something impossible. For 3,000 years we Velnathi have prided ourselves on our transcendence of physical limitations. We evolved beyond crude matter, beyond the need for solid bodies, beyond the restriction of 3-dimensional thinking. We believed this made us superior to species still trapped in flesh and locked into simple perception of reality. A group of young Velnathi approached the memorial, their energy forms flickering with curiosity and respect. They had heard the stories of the human sacrifice, and they came to pay their respects. Velthara watched them float silently around the monument, trying to understand how beings so different from themselves could have been so noble. The humans showed us that evolution is not always about transcending limitations, Velthara continued, his voice growing stronger. Sometimes true strength comes from embracing those limitations, from finding power in what others might consider weakness.